So first of all, any thoughts or questions or observations from last week? Let me apologize first. I was apparently very confusing in explaining what we were going to be talking about. My hope is that we will compare and contrast what we do tonight in the Compline services and the kind of prayer that is as a public shared corporate prayer with the sort of thing that we do on Sundays, which also is what we're examining and discussing tonight. So that's the idea. We'll talk about the Sunday service these evenings and then go into the Compline, which is a different sort of service, and hopefully in the contrast can find some matters of interest. But I didn't manage to communicate that clearly last week, so thank you for your forbearance. That said, any comments or questions or observations?
Just a question. I missed that point that Father Mashburn was discussing about the bishops and the unity message. And I thought he said there was in one of the handouts or bulletins Sunday, but again I missed it. Is that going to be on the internet?
It should be on the website, but it's a special website. What I will try to remember to do is to include that website in the next friendly reminder that goes out. How many of you were able to hear what Father John was saying on Sunday? We didn't have him mic'd as well as I would have liked, and
Yeah, he mentioned Bishop Nicholas was part of the meeting or the grouping or something, and that's why I wanted to see what that letter or review was before making a comment.
right. What that letter was, it was simply a joint letter sent out by the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops on the occasion of the Sunday of Orthodoxy. Now, the letter itself was very nice. It spoke of the triumph of the icons, of the unity of the faith, of the promulgation of the gospel throughout the entire world, and of our responsibility to live that faith. It was very nice. But what I find still more significant is who sent it, as he said. Not just our bishop, not just their bishop at St. John's, not just their bishop from St. Seraphim's, not just this bishop or that bishop, or not even just their archdiocese or our archdiocese, but all of them together, functioning in one accord.
Do they normally do it? I don't remember.
It is common for us to receive, encyclicals on major occasions from Archbishop Demetrius, and less frequently to receive encyclicals or letters from Metropolitan Nicholas. He would only send it if there was something that was particular to the metropolis of Detroit that needed to be addressed, and usually that only happens if there's a natural disaster of some sort. So the last time I remember seeing a letter from him that went out in common to the parishes, it was for, well, there were two. Last year, 2 years ago actually, in 2010, there was the letter asking for the parishes to raise money to support the flood victims elsewhere in the state of Tennessee. And then a couple months ago, there was a letter asking the parishes to raise money to send to the support of those who are in need in Greece now. We've not yet acted to fulfill that, but he wants us to raise money by the 25th to collect it and send it in through the metropolis to help out with the needs there.
My question was if it's common to send a common letter.
No, that's very unusual. Now, the predecessor. How many of you would know what SCOBA was if I asked you? Okay. SCOBA was, S-C-O-B-A. SCOBA was the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas.
What I got around to explaining what the purpose of and what the significance also of that whole group. Because I mean, I understood it was very big things. So.
All right, let's set this aside then, and let's talk about Sunday, because there's a lot there.
They were going to, they had planned obsolescence?
Yes. Let's go back to the beginning. The basic ecclesiology of the church, the way things are supposed to function from the beginning, or if you're a historical skeptic, from the 2nd century, when these things kind of finished panning out and became more or less regularized across the Roman world, is that you'll have an area, a geographical area, a province perhaps, or in our analogy, a state. In the state, there will be several cities, several communities. In each community, there will be a Christian church, an Orthodox Christian church. Each church should have a bishop by that rule. And then there will be a presiding bishop in the most significant city of the area. So, by that old model, we would have a bishop in Memphis who would have oversight of all of the Orthodox churches in Memphis. This is the analogy. This is how things were supposed to be. This is how things ran in the Roman Empire, both before and after the legalization of Christianity. So we would have a bishop in Memphis. One of these churches would be the cathedral church. And then the bishop would have the direct oversight of the entire community, with each parish functioning under his oversight. That bishop would be a part of a synod of bishops, of the bishops of all of the cities. So the bishop of Memphis, the bishop of Chattanooga, the bishop of, name me some other cities, not Nashville.
Oh, Knoxville.
The bishop of Knoxville, the bishop of Jackson, the bishop of, so you get the idea. Then, because Nashville is the capital, there would be the metropolitan bishop there, who would be the president of the synod. So for any matters dealing with the life of the church in the diocese of Tennessee, in the ecclesiastical province of Tennessee, the bishops of its cities would gather together and discuss them and come to an agreement in one accord, led by the president of the synod, who would be the Metropolitan Bishop of Nashville, that is to say, of the capital of the province, that is to say, the state. That is our ecclesiology. That is how the church is supposed to run. Now, the church in America is small. We have not a large population. So our metropolises end up being regional centers: Detroit, Boston, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Denver, San Francisco. And then we have priests that function in each individual city. We have an aberrant situation too, because the normal way for the Orthodox Church to grow would be for the church in some established place, in Greece, in Russia, somewhere or other, to say, we should bring the Orthodox faith to the barbarians of America. I'm joking, right? Okay. To those uncouth heathens who do not know how to say the Trisagion prayer, right? So we will send them a bishop and 10 priests with 20 deacons who will serve their needs and preach the gospel and establish churches on the same model as the apostles would do. They would go around and they would make, so that is how it should have happened if it were or had been a missionary enterprise. Orthodoxy did not come to this country as a missionary enterprise. Not broadly speaking. It came with the lay people who came to America, like everyone else came to America, looking for good jobs, better opportunity, and the chance to make a better life for themselves and their children. So you had Greek communities grow up, and now I'm basically going to run through a summary of Beyond Ellis Island and that book as it would be written for every other community, Greek or otherwise. They come from Greece, they come from Russia, they come from what had been the borders between Russia and Europe. They come from Syria, they come from Egypt, they come from other countries of the Balkans, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania. And they establish communities. When the communities get large enough, they start saying, we need a priest. Usually they decide they need a priest when they get wives from overseas and they want to get married. Then they need a priest, especially once they have kids and they need to baptize them. So what do? Well, they don't have a bishop in the States. So this is a nice little summary of Orthodox history in the U.S. So they write back to whatever city most of them come from. And they say, we need a priest. You have any lying around? And the bishop says, I don't have a good place to put him. Sure. Or sometimes, some guy says, well, I have a brother, and his wife has a cousin whose father is a priest. We'll ask if he wants to come. We'll promise him good money. Yeah. So they write the letter to, the brother's cousin's wife's sister, or whatever, sister's father, and sister's father. Okay, anyway. And they send a priest. So that is how the church came to be established here. Once there are enough communities, once there are enough people, eventually the churches overseas they've been persecuted, there've been wars. It's a troubled time in, in the Orthodox world at the end of the 1800s, right? So, we're talking the Russian Revolution is fomenting. It hasn't quite happened yet, but it's disrupted in Russia. It's disrupted in the Balkans. The Greeks and the Bulgarians are fighting each other then, right? Vespina? Mm-hmm. So, bad things are happening. But eventually, they realize we have a lot of people over there, and they have priests. And the one priest is answering to the bishop in Athens, and the other priest is answering to the patriarch in Constantinople, and the one priest is answering to the bishop of Veria. And why are they answering to Veria? Who answers himself? And the one priest is answering to Moscow, and so we should send them bishops, so that they have bishops there, and they're not having to write letters all the way back across the ocean to find out what they're supposed to do with this or that or the other thing. So the bishops come. But they don't send a single bishop to take care of all of the Orthodox. The Greeks send bishops, and eventually Athens and Constantinople decide, okay, Athens is going to take care of them. No, never mind. Constantinople is going to take care of them. No, wait, Athens is going to take care of them. No, it's going to be Constantinople. We've decided we're not going to change our minds again. The Greek churches in the United States are going to be taken care of by Constantinople. We're good. Russia takes care of Russia, Romania takes care of Romanians, Serbia takes care of Serbians, Damascus takes care of Syrians, and so on and so forth. And that's, in short, how we come to the place where we are now, where we have the Greek Archdiocese of America, which takes care, generally speaking, of the Greek Orthodox communities. We have the Antiochian Archdiocese of America, which takes care of those who came from the areas under the Patriarchate of Antioch, which is to say most of the Middle East except for Israel. There used to be a few churches that were under the Jerusalem Patriarchy, but now those are being under the Greek Archdiocese. There is the OCA, which had been the Russian mission here until the Russian Revolution disrupted the relationship between the Mother Church, which was heavily persecuted, of course, and the daughter church here in the United States. So what was the OCA operated without episcopal oversight from overseas until 1970, when they suddenly said, we're just going to make you autocephalous, which would have been fine if they were the only church here, but they weren't. So the OCA does their thing in sort of a Russian fashion, but trying to become American. Those are really the major churches. There is, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, the church abroad, and they have now become canonical, but that's not there isn't a parish of theirs here, so we don't need to talk about them. The three parishes we have here answer in short to three different bishops, who themselves are part of three different synods, which themselves answer to a synod overseas. That's fine. It grew up like that for pastoral reasons. But it means that if I want to go over to St. John's and participate in the baptism, I have to call Metropolitan Nicholas in Detroit and say, Your Eminence, may I have permission to leave the metropolis of Detroit so that I can enter the Diocese of Wichita? No, of Miami. It's Miami, under the Antiochian Archdiocese, and participate in a baptism. Will you write me a letter? You know, and he'll send me a letter, you know, or he'll just usually stamp it. Then I have to take that letter and send a fax to Bishop Antun in Miami and say, Your Grace. Maybe he's an archbishop, I don't know, Your Eminence, whatever. I have received permission from Metropolitan Nicholas, my hierarch, to leave the metropolis of Detroit and, with your blessing, enter the Diocese of Miami in order to participate in this baptism with your blessing and pending the permission of the local priest. All of that so that I can drive 10 minutes and do a baptism. Now, if I just want to go and visit, I can do that. I don't have to get a letter. But the reason for this is that a priest, and this actually gets back to what we're talking about here, we were going to get to the vesting prayers and how a deacon vests, how a priest vests, and how a bishop vests, which really means that we need to talk about what is a deacon, what is a priest, and what is a bishop. A priest functions only with the permission of the bishop. I don't wear the collar by right. I don't have the right to do anything on my own authority. I am simply the local representative of the bishop because, again, that old rule is one bishop in each city. Now, we can't practically have a bishop here because we only have one Greek Orthodox Church here. It wouldn't make sense for every single parish to have a bishop. So he sends a priest instead to take care of them. But the bishop has the pastoral authority. The bishop makes the church a church and not just a bunch of Greeks getting together to say yasu and drink ouzo. Opa! Right? Okay. I'm playing on all the old, silly tropes, right? The bishop is the pastor. He represents Christ, which means he is called to, as Christ says to Peter, feed the Lord's sheep, to care for the flock of the Lord. The priest is simply the one who assists him in that, with the further assistance in practical matters of the deacons. Now, because of that, if I walk into the Church of St. John's and say, I want to serve, they don't necessarily know me from Adam. I could just be some random American guy who grew a beard, bought a clergy shirt, figured out how to walk and kind of comport myself like a priest, bought a set of vestments, and walks in there and says, Hi, I'm Father Billy Bob. I would like to participate in the baptism. And they're going to say, all right, who's your bishop? That's the first question, which is to say, are you actually a priest? Do you have a bishop? Do you have the permission of a canonical Orthodox hierarch to present yourself as a priest, to serve as a priest, to do the work of the bishop in an area? Second, do you have the permission of our bishop to serve in this church? Because if you don't, you're not allowed. There's a cloth on the altar table that we unfold when we're performing the sacraments, when we're consecrating the gifts and preparing communion. It shows the scene of Christ being taken to burial, and on the bottom, it has the signature of Metropolitan Nicholas. It is the permission for this church to function, to do the sacraments. I kiss that signature every time as though I am kissing the bishop's hand and receiving his blessing to perform the sacraments. Okay? So, that's why this is a problem. That church on Tutwiler functions because there is a bishop in Miami that has sent priests there to minister to it. Theologically. Obviously, there's a broader history, and they went to the bishop and said, we would like to be a church that is a part of your archdiocese. Will you give us the permission to function as an Orthodox church here? And they did so, and it was complicated, and it's a beautiful story. Similar story for St. Seraphim's, farther towards downtown. Are they actually downtown? I'm still figuring out what's downtown, what's midtown.
I think they're over by Memphis.
Anyway. Okay. Same thing with them. They are a parish that functions because their bishop has sent them priests and has given them permission to function as an Orthodox church. It is not right that there should be 3 different bishops, in short, present in an individual city. There ought to be a bishop of Memphis, or at the very least a bishop of Tennessee, who has pastoral oversight for the probably 15, 20 Orthodox churches that there are in this state. So that's why, that is the current situation. Now, how do you fix that off the top of your head? Well, yes. And that's what SCOBA was. It was the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas. Now, it wasn't all the bishops. It was the heads of each jurisdiction. And there are actually more than the three that we talked about. There were like 8 or 9 members. But the Archbishop of the Greek Archdiocese, the Metropolitan of the Antiochian Archdiocese, the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in America, they all serve and function as part of SCOBA. SCOBA practically didn't have any authority. They could send out a pastoral letter, but they couldn't send out an encyclical because they don't represent all the bishops. And they didn't have the permission of the mother churches to function in that way, which is significant because you can't, anyway.
How long has it been?
SCOBA, about 50 years. Archbishop Iakovos and Metropolitan Anthony Bashir and whoever the OCA hierarch at the time were, they worked very hard together to put this in place. One of the major reasons it needed to be in place was for the sake of Orthodox Christians serving in the military. In World War II, there are funny stories. If you can ever talk to a Greek or a Russian who served in the Second World War, they'll tell stories about when it was time to go to services, right? And they'll say, all right, all the Jews, you go stand over there, and all the Protestants, you go stand over there, and all the Catholics, you go over there, and we'll send you your appropriate clergyman. And there are 10, 12 guys still standing there in the middle of the field, kind of milling around. They're like, what are you? I'm like, we're Orthodox. To which the CO would usually say, go be with the Jews, because Orthodox is a word that we generally associate with Judaism, right, in the U.S. So maybe it was World War I when this happened, but very early in this whole process, the primate, the head bishops of these various jurisdictions started working together, trying to get the United States government to recognize that there is something besides Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And it took a little while, but eventually they got the state of New York to recognize them, and that helped because then they had a state, so the federal government was more willing to do so. But SCOBA functioned very much, in practical terms in that capacity as the endorsing body for Orthodox chaplains in the service. They did a lot of other things. Eventually, a variety of ministries grew up. The International Orthodox Christian Charities, IOCC, functions not just as an extension of the Greek Archdiocese, but it was under the auspices of SCOBA, so that it could be the united charitable giving organization for the Orthodox churches in the U.S. The same with OCMC, the Orthodox Christian Mission Center. The churches support those together. They aren't just, because otherwise we would have the Antiochian missions body and the Greek missions body and the Russian mission body, and it helps us to cooperate on these things. But they couldn't really function because they didn't have the permission of those mother churches as a means of furthering unity and building towards a establishment of a normative canonical structure in the United States. Now, to be fair, this is a problem that is present around the world, everywhere that there isn't already a canonical church established. So that is to say, Western Europe, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas are all a little bit confusing. And they have overlapping jurisdictions from several different national churches. Yes?
Canonical meaning like canons? What is
Canonical.
Canonical.
Canonical is unfortunately a word that we use in several different ways, but it means according to the canons of the church, which stipulate how the church is supposed to be structured. Also simply according to the mind and the history of the church. You may not be able to find the principle in the canons that there is to be only one bishop in one city, although you can see the principle playing out and demonstrated in several individual canons. It's simply the way that the church has always functioned. So you'll speak of the canon of faith, which is to say the rule of faith, like the ruler, if you think of a yardstick or something. It simply means the experience, the practice, the history, the tradition of the church by which we measure what is right and what is wrong, what is appropriate and what is not. With the basic rule being, we do in the Orthodox Church what has been done at all times and in every place by those who call themselves Orthodox Christians. And if we continue that generation after generation, then, well, specifics may change according to the, our specific approach to this question or that question may develop according to pastoral need. The essentials of the faith do not change. So that's what we mean when we say that the canons are canonical. It refers both to the actual canons, the different articles adopted and accepted by ecumenical councils, and it refers to the broader rule of faith as established by Scripture and tradition and the holy canons across the board. So, anyway, so we were up to, SCOBA was good and helped us to cooperate in some ways, but it couldn't really function further to resolve the issue that we have. That can be very confusing for those who come to us from outside of the church, and many of you did at one point or another, or are doing so. So, a couple years ago, since the early part of the 20th century, there has been a movement, an effort to prepare for well, the idea is for another ecumenical council, that is a universal council to bring all of the bishops of all the Orthodox churches around the world together, because the last one we had was in 787, and that's a long time ago. The world has changed a lot. There aren't, some people will argue against it. They say, well, we don't really need it. There aren't, we don't have any ongoing doctrinal debates. We still confess the Nicene Creed. We still believe in this. We still believe in that. There's not a heresy that we need to meet and deal with, which was usually the cause for having an ecumenical council. So they stopped calling it an ecumenical council, and now they just call it the Great and Holy Council, primarily for disciplinary purposes, not to correct someone and not to spank anybody, but to make once again consistent the discipline of the church, to resolve several aberrant and confusing issues. Among them, the church in the so-called diaspora, that is to say outside the traditionally Orthodox areas where the canons are followed and everything is normative and normal. So, in the course of that effort, the diaspora has been probably the issue that's caused the most trouble, because, well, Russia has a lot of churches around the world, and they don't want to just give them up. And Constantinople has a lot of churches around the world, and it doesn't really want to give them up, especially since Constantinople, immediately after this whole thing happened, lost pretty much all of its population because they got shipped overseas in population exchanges with the Turks after the Greco-Turkish War, after the First World War. So everybody has a horse in the race, or as I'm told you should say in the South, a dog in the hunt. It's a matter of tremendous import to everybody, both for pastoral reasons, because, if you asked your average Greek, we need to reshuffle things to make sure that we have, one bishop in every city and not two or three, there. So we drew lots, and now we're going to have a Russian bishop. That wouldn't particularly go over too well, because the Greeks are going to say, then mas aresi esis. Ignore me because my Greek is not so good, right? But they're going to say, we don't know this guy. Who is he? Does he know how we do things? He's going to make us become Russians. He's going to tell us to honor the Tsar. Well, not the Tsar anymore, but he's going to tell us that we have to like Putin, and we don't like Putin. Thank you very much. He's ugly. Well, he looks good with his shirt off. He thinks, right? Okay. Anyway, these are the problems. So it's a difficult situation. But it needs to be resolved. And in the course of all of this, the mother churches finally had a meeting in 2009, and they said, to at least start the ball rolling, we're going to direct all of our daughter churches overseas to form episcopal assemblies, assemblies of bishops in each area, and then they defined the areas and they gave guidelines for how they should function and what authority they had and what they didn't have and what they were supposed to accomplish and what they weren't supposed to accomplish and what the ultimate goal was, which is to say to establish a canonical order for the churches in each specific area. Now this is a godsend. And as soon as this came out, everybody starts getting really excited, except for those who thought it was a really bad thing because they were worried again that they would lose the capacity to function as their parishes had been functioning. But that gave the permission and indeed the necessity for all of the bishops for SCOBA to go away, because SCOBA was always just a voluntary and unblessed organization for practical purposes. Instead, now all of the bishops have to meet. They've been meeting at least annually. They've met twice. They're scheduled to meet again in May, I believe. They have formed committees, to take care of the military chaplaincy, to take care of canonical irregularities, to figure out where our practice differs from point to point to point. How do we receive converts? Generally speaking, we have the same approach to this, but there are some variations. What do we do about divorce? Practically speaking, divorce is approached in a different way. The canons are interpreted differently from one church to another. To identify those problems, to work towards a common solution, becomes important. To maintain an up-to-date database of who are the canonical clergy in the United States. For all of you know, I could be just some Joe who walked in here and said, "Hi, I'm Father Anthony." I could have mugged the real Father Anthony, taken his shirt, and come in and said, "Hey, this is a pretty, pretty good thing." Of course, if I had done that, I might also be saying, "This is a lot harder than I thought. I'm going to go away." So, I'm kidding. You all have been wonderful, but it is true that the priesthood is never what you think it will be. Anyway. I have letters to show you that I am who I am. I can prove it if it comes down to that. Don't worry. But ultimately, it would be nice if, say, some fellow sets up a Russian Orthodox Church over on the other side of town. There isn't currently a Russian Orthodox Church in town. If someone comes in and says, "Hello, I am Father Vasily. I am going to make a Russian church. We want you to come and become part of a Russian church." Okay. I'm going to say, "Well, that's interesting, but who's your bishop?" And maybe he'll say, "Oh, he's over there somewhere." It would be nice if I could look him up and say, "Are you on the list or aren't you?" "I'm sorry, you're not on the list. We cannot concelebrate, although, of course, I wish you all the best in forming whatever kind of church you're forming. Have a wonderful day." It's not to be mean, but so that we know who is Orthodox and who is not, who has a bishop and who doesn't. And so that, God forbid, a priest who has been functioning legitimately is suspended. Maybe he requests to be returned to the status of a layman and then regrets it and wants to pretend that he didn't do that. Maybe he gets defrocked for some issue or other. It happens. It's unfortunate, but it happens. You want to be able to know, to figure out, okay, we can't let him into the altar and serve anymore. Or, more importantly, we don't want to let him near our kids. We, generally speaking, know. We're communicating with each other. These things are known, but it would be nice if there were a central database. So one of the committees is working on that. And one of the committees is working on canonical regional planning, which is to say figuring out what are the Orthodox churches in this country, what are their cultural needs, what are their linguistic needs, what are their liturgical needs, what bishops do we have at our disposal, what are the currently overlapping jurisdictions, and can we find a pathway, complicated and lengthy though it might be, to resolving this? So that instead of having a bishop in Detroit, a bishop, 60 minutes away in Grass Lake, and a bishop, another 150 miles away in Chicago, not just one, but probably 4 or 5, we start to kind of send them out so that maybe eventually we have a bishop of Nashville who has responsibility for Tennessee, with that being the ultimate goal. Better pastoral care for the parishes without losing the local ethnic and linguistic identity, and unity for the churches in each place. So it will of necessity be a long process, but it is a mechanism that has actually begun it. I encourage you to look at the website. It's assemblyofbishops.org, pretty easy to remember, especially if you want to get a sense for what does a bishop sound like, what are the concerns that a bishop will have, how do they feel about this. They have an ongoing series of audio conversations with our bishops. There's a priest out in California who's doing the same interview with each bishop, and he's moving through. A lot of them are not Greek Orthodox bishops. That can be instructive for those of us who are in the Greek Archdiocese. A few of them are. What their perspectives are, especially as time goes on. It's very interesting to see what the committees are, to see who the members are of them. Again, it's instructive. And then to see the little news updates that they put up, or the encyclicals. That's where you would find the letter that Father John read. The important point is now we have a unified voice. When there comes to be a controversy that the Church should weigh in on, like the Health and Human Services issue that we talked about a few weeks ago with regards to birth control and abortion, we have a medium now of putting together a statement that reflects the position of all the Orthodox Christians in the U.S. and making our feelings known, which is important, especially if in this broken and fallen world, other issues happen. If some person in the U.S. government decides that it would be a good thing to go to war with Greece, we can say, please don't do that. That would be a very bad thing. We don't like that idea, which would hopefully be productive. Is that a hand? Well, if the government decides it wants to go to war with some Orthodox country, then we at least have a unified voice to say, we would really, really, really rather you didn't do that. Surely we can find a better way to resolve whatever this issue is. Or at the very least, carry on the war a little bit better.
Such a broad, that term, an Orthodox country. I mean, you could have an Orthodox country that also think it was a Jewish country or think it was Romanian.
Well, the thing is, most Orthodox countries do identify themselves as such.
Okay.
Now, Russia certainly does. Greece certainly does. Romania certainly does. Serbia certainly does.
Okay, just those specific countries.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there are formally Orthodox countries like Turkey or Syria.
Well, that's
You know.
Turkey especially.
And for instance, they're not generally speaking Orthodox, but the war in Iraq has certainly seen many Christians there displaced and persecuted and deeply troubled. Individual priests and bishops have weighed in, but there hasn't been a unified voice saying this needs to be an active concern of our foreign policy. Whatever we do over there needs to take some account for the lives that are disrupted in this way. Christian and otherwise, of course, but certainly Christians. We have an alliance with the modern state of Israel. That's, in my estimation, a good thing. But at the same time, there are a lot of Christians in Israel, Orthodox Christians, who don't particularly come onto the radar necessarily. And as an allied country, we could exert some influence on the Jewish state there, on Israel, to say, treat your Christians better. The Catholic Church, I assume, has that as a standard part of its interaction with the U.S. government. We probably should too. We haven't had the means of doing it. Those may not be the best examples. You will note that the Assembly of Bishops has not yet weighed in on those things because they're politically fraught. There is a legitimate perspective on both sides. We weigh in where we must, as on the Health and Human Services issue.
That's a broad issue. At best.
Anyway, so does that make a little bit, give some context for what Father John was talking about on Sunday? Okay. I would advise you all to go and read the letter again. It was a good letter. And look over that website. There's a lot of good stuff there, and there will continue to be more as time goes on. More to the point, the more that our lay people and clergy pay attention to this process and invest in this, the more it becomes apparent that it is a priority. Sometimes it can feel like in the parishes we don't really want to change. We're perfectly content to function like we do. It's a good thing for us all to think about it. What does it mean that all of you can walk down to St. John's any day of the week and receive communion there, so long as you're baptized and chrismated in the Orthodox Church here? And if they ask you there, where are you from, you'll say, I am a parishioner in good standing at Annunciation. You can call Father Anthony and he'll vouch for me. That works right now, but I can't go with you. Not if I want to serve. That's a problem. I had to call Metropolitan Nicholas and ask his permission to have Father John and his associated priests and Father Mark come and participate. Normally, technically, they would have all had to get letters of permission from their bishops to leave and letters of permission from Metropolitan Nicholas to come and serve. He waived that requirement because it's a long-standing tradition in the parish, and, well, it's a Sunday of Orthodoxy. It's a day to kind of remember our unity. Also because he knows that I've interacted with them and I can vouch for their orthodoxy, that they are still in good standing with their bishops. I checked that out. But that is something that needs to happen, which is fine, but it's not ideal, and we can certainly see something better down the road, right? So, any questions about the three orders of clergy before we go in there, since that was that'll bring us back to the liturgy.
I had a question about the function of, and only because we never had one, so I'm not real sure what a deacon.
What is a deacon?
I don't know what they do.
I was going to ask that, so thank you.
Yeah, well, all we had was Father Brown all the time.
No. Δέσποινα, τι σημαίνει διάκονος?
Somebody who serves.
That's right. A servant. A servant. Someone who serves. So you can think like a waiter. Now, that's actually, scripturally, where the diaconate came from. Anybody have a Bible?
You want me to go get one?
No. Echo. In Acts, no, not John, Acts. Pay attention. Okay. Just give me a moment. I think it's Acts 4.
I just wasn't sure how, I couldn't tell the difference between the deacons and the priesthood.
Understood. There are three orders of clergy, in short. You have priests, deacons, priests, and bishops. So, Act 6. And in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, when the church grew, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, that is to say, of the Greek Jews against the Hebrew Jews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Now, we've gone over before what's happening in the early church. Everyone has given up their property to the hands of the apostles, and the apostles are taking care of, that they are distributing the common good. This is not how the church functions anymore, but it was how things happened at the very beginning. The apostles are distributing to those who are in need, especially to the widows. One assumes that people didn't give up their entire livelihood, but they gave up their extra property so that the apostles would have the means to care for the poor and the needy. Now, the apostles are all what? Hebrews. So they're taking care of the people that they know. Possibly the people, it's not that the apostles are favoring one person over another, but even in the church today, who gets to talk to the priest? Does the priest go around and call everybody? Nope, doesn't have time. People who talk to the priest are the ones who call the priest, who email the priest, who pester the priest. If the priest forgets to call them back, who call them again. Because we're busy. Well, because the church has grown, because we have a lot of people. The same thing is apparently happening in the early church. Some people, the apostles knew. They knew their need, they knew their problems, they heard of what the need was, and they took care of it. Others, they didn't know. But people, what happens if someone goes to the hospital? Right? Because I hear this all the time. Someone's in the hospital, and then I hear they're very disappointed that the priest didn't come. Well, I didn't know they were there, but they assume they're in the hospital. Surely someone told the priest. Well, no. And if there were more of me, then we would go around to the hospitals and make sure that we always were looking for the Orthodox Christians. But there's one of me. So this is not me shilling for getting a deacon, by the way. But this is the analogy, right? So the 12 apostles called the multitude of the disciples unto them, and they said, "It is not reasonable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables." Now that sounds a little harsh, but they're saying, look, we have a job to do. We're supposed to be going into all the world and preaching the good news to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to do whatever He has commanded us, for He is with us always, even to the end of the age. That's our job. We're getting a little bit bogged down in making sure that everybody has a little piece of bread to eat every day. Not a bad thing, but we need help. Therefore, brethren, look out among you, find 7 men of honest report who are full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, so that we can appoint them over this business, but we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. So the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose 7 men, whom they set before the apostles, and when they had prayed, they laid their hands on them, and the word of God increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient. Anyway, that's getting beyond. Those are the first 7 deacons. Now, the first of them was Stephen, who was then stoned, and a young man named Saul was taking care of the coats of the people who were throwing the rocks and killing Stephen while they were doing it. He became Paul, and then became the apostle, and all of that was, history. But so that's what the deacons were for. They were to assist the apostles, who can stand in for the bishops, and the priests, who were established in the churches that the apostles founded as they went around initially, and then bishops were established. So the deacon has a specific set of tasks. He leads the people in prayer. All of those petitions that the priest usually does, you notice we didn't say any of them. The deacon did all of them. That's the deacon's job. The priest does the conclusion, the exclamation at the end. In peace, let us pray to the Lord. The people say, Lord, have mercy. So it's supposed to be this conversation between the deacons and the priests or the bishops and the people, a dialogue that goes on. Usually our churches are small. We only have 1 priest and a choir, and it seems like this very pared down reality, but it's supposed to be a very active community experience.
The deacons read
the deacons,
Bible passage.
The deacons would read, they would proclaim the gospel. And the deacons would distribute communion. The deacons would go and visit the sick and bring communion to them. The deacons would have the care of cleaning the altar, which right now I'm doing, assisted by the beautiful women of the altar cleaning committee. But there are supposed to be, properly speaking, these are the needs of the church. I can say that they're the needs of the church because we still have to do them all, but very often they all fall on whoever happens to be there all the time, which is to say, the priest, which is good and fine, but it speaks of the continuing need. Now, over at St. John's, why do they have deacons? They have deacons because they don't pay their deacons. They're deacons with a lay profession, we would say. So they still work, I presume, unless they're retired now, and then they'll serve on Sunday. There is room for that in the Greek Archdiocese. A program was recently created so that men who wished to become deacons could study long distance and then go to Holy Cross in the summertime for a period of weeks for a few years, and not get a Master of Divinity, not be able to function as priests, but have a degree, at least an assurance on the part of the church that they know what they need to know to represent themselves as clergy, because the deacons are clergy. You don't call them deacon, you call them father, as you call a priest. They don't have the full capacity to function that a priest does. A deacon cannot consecrate the gifts. A deacon cannot do a baptism. He cannot, in fact, do any of the sacraments. He can administer them once they have been done. So a deacon I would assume, could anoint with evangelion, in a pinch. But he can't consecrate it. A priest can consecrate it. A priest can consecrate the gifts. A priest lends his hands to God to do these things on behalf of the bishop. And only a bishop can make a priest. And a bishop can a bishop can't even make another bishop. You have to have 3 bishops to make another bishop. So that in all of these things there is order.
How long has this program been in effect in the Greek Church?
4 or 5 years. It's new.
It wasn't around long. It hadn't been around long.
No. Generally speaking, the diaconate in the Greek Archdiocese has been functioning simply as a stepping stone to the to the priesthood, but there is room for that. And most priests that I know kind of have their eyes peeled. They're looking for the pious, faithful, knowledgeable, and willing men who might be able to serve that way. But that's a burden too, because once you enter into the clergy, you can theoretically be transferred, and not a lot of men want to, even theoretically put themselves, in that position. So it's still being worked out, but that's what they're doing over at St. John's. St. John's, it kind of makes sense because they're all family anyway. The deacon who was serving is the brother of the priest with the big beard,
Yeah.
Father John. So, Father Deacon Timothy. So, but that's what a deacon does.
He was my boss.
Alethea?
Yes.
Was he a good boss?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't answer that. So, other questions? You have a baffled, or not baffled, but boggled look on your face.
My question is back to the whole, like is the metropolis of Detroit or whatever. I don't understand why we went to Village Harper Festival last May.
Mm-hmm.
It was every Sunday. And there were people, all of us were from under, Detroit, and there were people from New York, and Kentucky, and Tennessee, and we're all sitting around, nobody understood why the layout is the way it is. Is there an explanation?
I'm sure there is. My memory, someone who's been here for a while, I believe I saw a letter stating that it was at the consecration of the church, the bishop that was responsible for the parish was of some, they used to number the archdiocese in districts, instead of having, dioceses in a specific city, and then that bishop was in Texas somewhere. So obviously, that has been fluid. If you ask me, I spent some time in the Deep South, and Memphis is distinct from the Deep South. It's not the same thing. I've spent some time on the East Coast, and Memphis is definitely different from that. I grew up in the Southwest, and once you get into Texas, you're pretty much in the Southwest, and that's a different thing entirely. I visited New York City. Culturally, Detroit makes sense. It's not Chicago. It's not that Illinois Midwestern thing exactly. It's more Rust Belt than Midwest, if you speak of a cultural thing. I see a common thread between parishes in Michigan and upstate New York and parts of Ohio and Indiana and Kentucky and Tennessee and Arkansas. Is not quite Deep South, although I would probably put Arkansas with something else. That doesn't make sense to me at all. But maybe the cities are different, because I just remember rural Arkansas, and that was an experience. I was in Wittenberg, Arkansas. Wittenberg. They probably called it Wittenberg, but in Germany it's Wittenberg, right? So, Wittenberg, Arkansas, was a town that my great-grandfather had served as a Lutheran pastor in the 30s. When my grandfather was a boy, and apparently was quite fat, because they called him Fatty. So it was amusing for me because my grandfather, I'm not as trim as I'd like to be, but my grandfather is all muscle. A lean, mean something machine, if you will. And all of these Arkansas men were twice his tonnage, probably. So one of them, commented as they were all sitting around, it's a bit ironic that we used to call you fatty. And I'm like, I would agree. So, anyway, so Arkansas seems like something else to me. But, Tennessee, you all are a bit different, but you still feel roughly like in common with everywhere else I've been, if that makes sense. Yeah, when we're together, it can seem like we don't have anything in common, but that was the case between Buffalo and Rochester, for pity's sake. So each parish has its own identity. Yeah, they're an hour and a half away. I'm just saying. Parish to parish, city to city. Well, Nashville and Memphis look like that on the map if you're in New York, too. So.
Did you say that your great-grandfather was a preacher?
Yes.
So would that make you a convert?
It would make me a convert.
How did that journey come around for you? Into Orthodoxy? It's different.
I would.
It's an understatement.
Because in my previous, when I was traveling to Seattle, I used to go in the community small Annunciation Church.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a convert church. 10 years ago, they had the whole parish had converted from, I think, whatever they were into Antioch. So easy to relate to because of my situation. I just want to know how did this process come around for you?
Well, my mother was raised Roman Catholic. My father was raised Lutheran. I like to joke and say when I was born, they compromised and became Pentecostals. Which pretty much sums it up, even if it's a little bit odd. The interesting thing about Pentecostals is that I forget the technical term for it, but a foundational tenet of the Pentecostal movement is the desire to reestablish the original primitive reality of the church. To live like the apostolic church did, and to be filled with that same grace and power and sense of purpose, I suppose. So I got that growing up, but eventually found the Pentecostal church I was in not living up to that standard, if you will. So I started looking, and eventually I bumped into a young man who was Greek Orthodox and went to church with him at a Romanian convent, actually. And I was chrismated a couple of years later. So that is the very cut down version of it. But, cut down even further, I was looking for the ancient church. I didn't really expect to find it. It happens that I did.
Where did this happen?
Michigan. Which is why I, who grew up in Arizona, am under the omophorion of Metropolitan Nicholas of Detroit, because I became Orthodox there. So. Shall we wrap it up? We have a service to do. So, next week, please bring these again, but I'll probably print them out again further. My goal is to have for you in this little booklet eventually the entirety of the preparation service, and then I'll do a second booklet that'll have the liturgy in it for you, and then we'll go over that over the course of the next few weeks, and probably beyond, since we're running out of Lent, believe it or not. Sound good? All right. We'll see you all in church then.